There is there is a substantial difference between the way of operating, like as Yuri mentioned, of modernistic principles were largely based on the eraser of the past, on the almost complete the complete destruction or the complete hollowing out, the voiding of the space of the city in order to impose a new order, a new structure, right? And this was done not only by the war, by the destruction of the war, but also was envisioned as a way of improving cities, like in these plans from Le Corbusier for Paris or for many other cities, where basically the planning strategy was the cleaning of all traces of the past, all traces of historical fabrics, and then this superimposition of this new order, of this new spatial regime, we may call it, right? Which was largely based on an open space, on the void as a defining feature, and then buildings becoming just objects situated within this void, right? Several examples for this. The Plan Voisin for Paris is a great example of that. The very clear negation of any value to be carried forward from the historical urban fabrics, and this imposition of a new street order, which is defined by the monumentality of architecture, right, as an object placed in the void. And that's a critique that we will see later on. And then this tension also happening within modernity, right? As I'm trying to portray here, modernity is not monolithic, so we have the internal tensions and internal contradictions of this. And some of the critiques of modernity point towards this direction, right? As we've seen, a generation that is already questioning the authoritarian kind of top-down, kind of very aggressive way of planning, but even to the point, for instance, Marshall Berman referring to subtraction when talking about New York and the demolition of older fabrics and, you know, the different neighborhoods to kind of modernize, looking at these processes of demolition as an herbicide, like the killing of the city, basically, right? So the assassination of the urban space. And in this, across this span of few decades, could say from the 50s, 60s, 70s, there is a growing opposition or sensibility against modernistic kind of planning or modes of planning, which, as we see in this illustration or this vignette, look at modernistic procedures not only as the construction of a new civilization that it was aimed to be, or a construction of a new modern city, but actually as a destruction of the city life itself, right? In this picture, the boulevard of Paris seen more of a cleaning again, of a killing the city, rather than an establishment of a new progressive space. According to David Harvey, urban geographer, the difficulty with the so-called high modernism and the urbanization was not the totalizing vision. So it's not like this full comprehensive idea of a city or what urbanity might be, but the persistent habit of privileging things and spatial forms over social processes. And so adopting a metaphysical approach that presumed that social engineering could be accomplished in a physical form. That's pretty much a straight critique of Le Corbusier's belief that through the manipulation of urban form, social conditions may change or may improve inevitably, like directly. And so this was the very quick sketch of this otherwise almost 60, 70, 80 years of, of modern movement. So postmodernity. And again, postmodernity is not a homogeneous kind of monolithic movement or period, as modernity was not. It was very much contested and it was challenged. Of course, there was a hegemonic series of ideas or ideologies of leading figures, but there were always, there were other modernities. There were several modernities in different geographies, in different countries, but also within countries with people claiming different positions to things. Postmodernity is, in fact, sometimes encapsulated or just kind of understood as one kind of unitarian idea or position or movement, but in fact there are many different strands coexisting within this so-called postmodern period or postmodern approach. So I think this is also very important to bear in mind in order to not, even though we always simplify, and I'm obviously simplifying here, not to oversimplify too much, right? And not to think that there is just one thing as modernity or just one thing as postmodernity. I think it's much more complex. So in here, I'm going to, again, try to sketch very quickly different approaches to postmodern, what we may call postmodern urban planning. And postmodernity obviously refers to modernity, or is formulated as a critique of modernity, which starts from a philosophical critique. We could say probably the first reference, or at least the most commonly accepted reference as kind of opening up the postmodern critique of modernity, is the book by Jean-François Lyotard, a philosopher that wrote The Postmodern Condition in 1979. And then it kind of grew into cultural studies and other artistic or cultural expressions, from art to literature to architecture, and then urban planning, which usually we come always after all the others. And in this case, probably was also quite the truth. So a series of very influential books that set somehow the theories or the critique of modernity in these postmodern lenses. Jean-François Lyotard elaborating a critique of what he called the grand narratives. So big totalizing ideas that try to make sense of the world in one full theory or in one full kind of a school of thought. So a critique of these big grand ideologies or narratives, and claiming for a kind of a more fragmented understanding of reality. And so understanding a reality as a bunch of contesting power relations or contextual situations that will never be able to provide a full picture of what the world is or what reality is, right? So it's a kind of critique of an structuring idea of the world, structuring vision of the world as universal, as unitarian, and so on. And when it comes more to Lyotard's is more of a philosophical, let's say, critique. On the other hand, Frederick Jameson and David Harvey provide, even though they engage also heavily in let's say, in philosophical aspects of it, they also provide Frederick Jameson a cultural analysis of what postmodernism might be, is or might be, as a cultural logic, as a cultural expression of an historical period that he calls late capitalism, right? But according to Jameson, this historical period, or this economic political context in which we are in since the 70s, 80s, and so on, has a cultural expression, has an aesthetic component also. So it's expressed in our cities, in our architecture, in our artistic expressions, to the point that it really formalizes as one culture, let's say, as one way of looking at culture. And he really goes into architecture and provides an analysis, architectural analysis of a series of buildings, like the Bonaventura Hotel in the United States and so on. So looks at Las Vegas, Los Angeles. So. And David Harvey also provides, as I said earlier, he's an urban geographer, so provides a spatial analysis of this postmodern condition. But let's just this to situate our discussion in a more general, broader sense. When it comes to urban planning, postmodern urban planning, urban design, and I've already pointed or gave some glimpses towards where's the direction that this is taking or where this is going. I would argue that an essential component or an essential characteristic of postmodernity when it comes to the city is the retreat, is the shrinking of the discipline, we could almost say. The shrinking of the discipline in terms of scale, but also in terms of ambitions, into the realm of architecture, into the realm of the fragment. So quite literally, assuming this critique of the big narrative, of the totalitarian visions of the world, universal visions of the world, modernity, some kind of modernity attempted to provide, and then focusing in partial local views of fragmented spaces, right? So in this way, we could look at it as the end of planning. The end of planning understood as this comprehensive view or take on the city, and the emergence of what's been called the architectural city. So a city that is defined by architectural objects, architectural artifacts, as opposed of a normative planning. And there are, again, several ways of going about it, and several authors engaging in these kind of new formulations about architecture, about the city, about the urban condition. And I've just summarized a bunch here. There are more. I think these are highly influential, all of them. Some I prefer ones versus others, but this I leave up to you to just pick. But these I've set up this kind of collage of references also to show how there are many different positions that engage in this critique of the grand narrative in a way. And probably the first series of books from architects, urban planners, sketching or pointing towards this critique appeared in the late 60s from Aldo Rossi's and the architecture of the city, like L'architettura della città, but especially in the 70s, we had different samples or examples of this from Europe to United States, and also coming from different backgrounds and traditions. And there are usually Aldo Rossi and Robert Venturi, Dennis Scott Brown, Learning from Las Vegas are regarded as kind of early, most foundational books, because also they came earlier, and representatives of two schools, the European and the American, postmodern, urbanism. But obviously, I would really open up this spectrum to other kinds of approaches. And for instance, the three on the bottom, I think are very relevant because not only because they share some, they differ in many aspects, and they really oppose each other in many aspects, but they also share kind of a common understanding or a common ground that I think it makes it interesting to look at them together. And also because they were basically published in the same year, almost in the same year, right? 1977, 1978, we see the publication of Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas, College City by Colin Rowe and Fred Koetter, and the city, Berlin's Green Archipelago by Oswald Matthias Ungers, which was not published as a book actually, but was a project manifesto produced in 1977 by Ungers, in collaboration with Rem Koolhaas and other important architects like Hans Kohlhoff of the time. You could combine and look at these projects in many different ways. As I said, these two sometimes are seen or regarded as foundational books, in as much they opened new ways of critique or new theories of architecture and urbanism, one representing an European approach, another representing an American approach. But in fact, if we look at the American context, there are a bunch of other people's books and authors that could be located there, right? From the Jane Jacobs' very famous Death and Life of Great American Cities, to Rainer Banham's Los Angeles, the Architecture for Ecologies, or actually Rem Koolhaas' Delirious New York, as is the case of Rainer Banham, is an European writing about an American city. And so in this sense, it's not that clear cut, right? And you could also look at them in another way. You could clearly identify, which is what I'm going to do following next, these three books or these three authors as sharing some common elements as opposed to the others. Or, as I said, you can also pick these three. So this I leave a bit up to you how to play around and use all of this set of references. So how I'm going to structure the following minutes is trying to provide these three understandings of, or I wouldn't call them even schools or movements or anything like that, but I just, similarities or affinities, let's say, within postmodern urbanism. One would be the architectural city, second one, the pop culture, pop urbanism, popular urbanism, and the third, a new historicism or a new traditionalism. The architectural city represented by Aldo Rossi, Oswald Matthias Ungers, and Colin Rowe. Starting with Rossi and the architecture of the city. First, he already positions himself in a quite distant understanding of the city than that of modernistic movement, in as much he looks at architecture, he looks at the city as architecture. So he doesn't really kind of consider all of the social engineering that we've seen in the modernistic movement, all of the central planning in order to arrange, right, a full geography almost. Rossi looks at the city as a process of construction, as a material process of construction, which he calls architecture. So he calls also architecture a construction over time, with an historical dimension, right? I think it's interesting because it both merges architecture and city into one continuous evolving process. And he sometimes is referred as the author that put together this notion of architectural artifact, like the element that really defines the city. But sometimes it's been brought to confusion, or there's a misreading of this term, right? Because architectural artifact, which is how it's been translated into English, sometimes might be understood as an object, as a physical object, right? So architectural object that defines the city. But in fact, the original expression was in Italian, il fatto urbano, which would be translated as an event in a way, right? So el fatto urbano, which is in Latin languages, it exists, le fait urbain in French, or el hecho urbano in Spanish. It's a kind of mix of urban artifact, but also, I would say, urban event. So it's a situation that happens in the city, and it may have a temporal dimension also. So in this sense, it's important not to stick to the materiality of architecture in the understanding of Rossi, but in this architecture having the potential of creating an event, an urban event, right? So yeah, it implies not only physical thing, but also its history, geography, structure, connection with the general life of the city. Important thing. So, and also to move away of this perhaps oversimplification of Rossi's position as interested in an architectural object, I think it's very important to bring back his interest in geography and his understanding of the city as a geographic system, or as interdependent from a larger geographical manifestation of the city, right? So as I said, he looks at architecture as this continuous process of construction that can take many different forms. And in his book, we have several illustrations like this one in the picture, which is what we might consider not a very urban or a kind of city-like image, right? But just a path or a road climbing up a hill with a series of constructions or elements along it, or a series of settlements forming, right? So there's definitely a physical material expression of architecture, but it's connected to many other scales and processes. So Rossi writes, the history of the city is always inseparable from its geography. Without both, we cannot understand the architecture that is the physical side of this human thing, this human construction that he claims is the city, right? But you always need to understand it in relation to history, in relation to the form of the territory, in the form of the geography, right? He even claims us to say that the city and its surrounding geography make one unity, one persona, right? A one character. And funnily enough, the first image, if I'm not mistaken, I'm just checking the book here. Okay, so it's not the same. Oh yeah, it's the same image, but if we take away the epilogue and so on. So it's the first image appearing in his book is the one you see, this engraving of this bridge in the territory, right? As an example of architecture. So in this way, Rossi positions the role of the architect not only in creating the centrality of the city, but also it expands it to this relation to topographic landscape elements, territorial infrastructural elements, and so on. Right? Among, and this is going to be also very quick hints on what these books contain or develop, obviously, for obvious reasons, just to pick some of the crucial ideas in each book for you to have a bit of a brief picture, of a quick picture of them. Important ideas put forward by Rosa in the book: the permanence of form and the interest in the idea of type, in the idea of an architectural type defined largely by geometrical simple forms, right? How elemental forms have a great power and a great strength in defining these historical continuities of space in the city, and how they really activate this form that remains, the permanence of form, right? So in this sense, he largely engages in his designs in trying to find these elemental forms that ultimately, you know, will become part of the permanence of the city, or will really fuse or merge in the historical transformation of the city, regardless of their functions or of their programs, right? And then the historical examples show how certain architectures have been transformed or have housed many different functions across history, or across different periods, right? So he puts this emphasis that he separates also a big distinction with the modernistic functional zoning. He separates the role that these architectural artifacts play in the city from their functions and their meanings, because these functions and meanings are given by any historical period, but any given society, and they keep changing, right? The demands and the requirements and the ways of interpreting and providing meaning to the symbolism of architecture changes. But also, and then connecting back to what I was introducing earlier, he does not look at this permanence of form or these elemental forms and architectural types only in as physical architectural projects or as physical objects. One of the important also ideas he formulates is the primary area and the concept of area. The primary element and the concept of area as determining features of a city development, right? Primary elements being that essential elements of the city that really frame and constrain their development, and areas which are somehow associated. When it comes to primary elements can clearly be buildings, can clearly be objects or architectural types or artifacts like we've seen so far, but he also uses the example of Chicago plan, or also the example of Barcelona extension plan by Cerda as primary elements, right? So this helps us understanding his view as a more complex, as a more rich, more nuanced understanding of what a primary element. So primary element being the element that determines the transformation and the persistence of the city, right? That gives character to the city, basically. It's very much what characterizes a certain space, certain type of settlement. This would be a primary element. And for him, a primary element could be also a plan regulation, right? Like the plan for Chicago that you've seen with Yuri, or the plan for Barcelona. So, as he writes, frequently primary elements are not even physical, constructed, measurable artifacts. For example, sometimes the importance of an event itself gives place to spatial transformation of a site, right? So primary element like being this driver for spatial transformation of a site that remains over time, somehow has a persistence or a continuity. In his drawing or project for the analogous city, in the 70s, 76. He creates a collage or an image or a panel that I think summarizes very much some of these questions, or many of these questions, or his understanding of the city, right? And if we look closer in detail to this image, we see clearly the geometrical figures, the elementary forms, the difference, complexity of architectures, the historical traces, but also the inability to understand all of it as one single model or as one single structuring principle. So we clearly see this idea of the architectural fragment, the architectural object, in dialogue or in relation to many other objects. But we also see how the city forms a continuity with its geography, with the territory, with the landscape, right? Infrastructural elements mixed with housing elements or fabrics, with public, with kind of architectures with a public dimension or with a public program. So all of these elements assembled into one very heterodox whole in a way, right?